All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Meta here, and welcome back to Meta Monday, the weekly series where we analyze the Pokemon Pocket metagame and keep you guys up to date on everything going on in the competitive world of Pokemon Pocket. This is the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly number 34, the largest weekly tournament series in Pokemon Pocket. And we are now going into the third week of this EEVEE Grove A3B season. We're going to start off this video by taking a look at the final standings, seeing which decks place the highest amongst all of the other participants in the tournament, and then we're going to go ahead and dive into the deck lists, talk about them in some more detail, and then at the end of the video, which I always say is very important, we're going to go into the metagame tab and take a look at all of the data and statistics, which is going to provide valuable context for everything that we go over in today's video. So don't forget to like and subscribe, utilize the timestamps if you'd like, down in the description below. You can jump ahead, feel free to do that however you would like. They're down there for a reason. And yeah, let's get right into it, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I think I already said that. Anyway, Giratina and Darkrai winning this week. These are the final standings. Yes, I know everybody's going to overreact. They're going to be like, oh my God, Giratina Darkrai, the best deck of all time. It keeps winning. It's a problem. Listen, Giratina Darkrai is, and this is just another sort of trophy in the trophy case for Darktina here. Giratina Darkrai, the #1 deck in the history of Pokemon Pocket. It went 12-1-1, I say it, but it was really this player here from the US, Mames123, who went 12-1-1. There was another player that went 12-1-1, and that is S0 Random Ways, and he was playing Sylveon and Solgaleo, another interesting deck list, which we talked about a bit on Friday. No surprise that it made it to finals this weekend. Third and fourth place here, Pepin MX and Why Hello There are both playing Sylveon and Greninja, widely regarded as the top deck of this format so far. Darkus here, or Dark US, I'm not sure, from Spain, got 5th place with Giratina and Darkrai. 6th place, Handsome Jack from Venezuela was also playing Sylveon and Greninja. And then if we go down here, 7th place, Jay Dankus was playing Charizard. And then we've got a Sylvally Oricorio here, Bastari, which we've seen. I feel like this player here is on the standings all the time. Anyway, from the US, 9-3 playing Sylvally Oricorio. And if we go down here, we've got some more Sylveon and Greninja, a bunch more Charizards, actually. Charizard did actually quite well in this tournament. Some more Sylveon, Greninja, and Oricorio, and Sylvally right here. There was one Leafeon and Flareon here at 16th place, and there was another one down here at 22nd place. And that's kind of it. What we're seeing in the format right now, and I guess if we go way down to 25th place, we do see a Buzzwole Pheromosa. We see a Magnezone here at 28th place, and we see a Garchomp at 30th place. That's kind of what's going on here. Arceus, Tapu, Koko at 39th place. So that's really what the format is right now, at least in terms of which decks are at the top of the standings. All of the decks that are here at the top of the standings this weekend are actually all of the decks that saw the most play of this tournament. And that's really what we end up seeing as we kind of move farther into the formats, right? As we're kind of later into the season, as we're going into week 3 here, we see that oftentimes it's the most commonly played decks that are the best decks, right? Those two things really merge together, and people play them because they're good, and they do well because, you know, they're good, and a lot of people play them, and that's really what happens, right? So anyway, let's quickly talk about Giratina and Darkrai. Getting first place, what does that mean? To be fair, what it means is that Giratina Darkrai is a good deck list. Any of these strong decks and good decks that are in this format right now could always win, right? Giratina Darkrai has been around for quite some time. That's why I oftentimes refer to it as the greatest deck in the history of Pokemon Pocket. It has remained relevant for quite some time. The last few weeks have really slowed down for Giratina and Darkrai. It's always placed fairly well in tournaments. It's a consistent deck, one of the most consistent, if not the most consistent deck in Pokemon Pocket. But in general, it just always sees enough play and is a good enough deck where it always has a chance to win. And honestly, you know, no surprise here that it won this week. However, I will say that I believe that the kindness of the format as it relates to Giratina and Darkrai has really been on the decline. I think a lot of the decks that are popular in the format right now are actually quite strong against Giratina and Darkrai. Some examples of that, you know, would be, of course, Charizard, which I think has a good Giratina Darkrai matchup, and then Oricorio, which traditionally has been a pretty significant counter to Giratina and Darkrai. It managed to kind of dodge all of those. So let's quickly take a look here, because one thing I am interested in always is to see the path, like the route, right? The journey that this player went on to win this tournament. As we see here in day 1 and throughout this entire tournament, predominantly did play Sylveon and Greninja, which of course is the most popular deck of the format, so no real surprise there. They played 4 of them in a row in day 1. He tied against Charizard and actually lost against one of these Sylvally or Sylveon and Greninja decks. He beat Garchomp and then also beat Sylvally Oricorio, which is quite impressive. In day 2, he beat 3 Sylveon and Greninjas, did beat a Charizard, beat another Giratina Darkrai, and then ended up beating Solgaleo in the finals. So most of the time did play Sylveon and Greninja, which is interesting. Giratina Darkrai does technically have a favorable matchup against that particular deck list. But anyway, let's take a look at the #1 placed deck in this tournament, Giratina and Darkrai. And this is going to be a pretty standard version of Giratina and Darkrai. What we saw saw a little bit last format and also at the beginning of this format was the Poison variant of Giratina and Darkrai, which really rose in play with Poison Barb and Nihilego as a counterplay to Oricorio. I think what a lot of people realized going into this sort of third week was that a lot of the Oricorio decks that we're seeing a lot of play in the format weren't actually playing many healing cards or weren't playing Guzma or things like that. So there was really no need, is really what it kind of chalked down to. There was much less of a need to play that Poison variant in Giratina and Darkrai because it just really wasn't actually doing much, right? So they ended up kind of swapping back to the traditional Giratina and Darkrai deck, playing 2 Rocky Helmet, 1 Giant Cape, and then no other Pokemon other than Darkrai EX and Giratina EX. And the deck list honestly does quite fine. I think that Sylvally decks, or rather Oricorio decks moving forward, are going to have to really lean into that healing factor and maybe the Guzma cards to discard the Rocky Helmets and such to really outpace Giratina and Darkrai, right? If Oricorio isn't playing any healing and they're not playing any Guzmas, then they will inevitably get whittled down by the Nightmare Aura pings and the Rocky Helmet pings, right? That's 40 damage per turn. Giratina Darkrai, very high HP basic EX Pokemon, and we are playing Pokemon Center Lady and Giant Capes and whatnot, so they can really survive for quite some time. And Oricorio itself isn't doing much damage, right? So you kind of have to, I think really anybody playing Oricorio right now kind of has to change the deck list, and I think we'll probably see that as the weeks go on. I think Oricorio will have to lean a little bit more into its sustainability to get around Giratina and Darkrai. But we all know what Giratina and Darkrai is, right? It's just 2 really strong Pokemon that ramp together. They work well together, being Darkrai and Giratina, and then you play just a ton of trainer cards, a lot of one-ofs in this particular deck list, which in my mind is kind of the better way to play it, mainly because this is a slower ramp deck that really enjoys taking its time and getting set up. And inevitably, we're going to draw through most of these trainer cards eventually, right? And they all provide certain value to the deck list, and they all do kind of unique things, right? So why not just have kind of one of everything and hope that you draw into them? This deck list playing 1 Mars, 1 red card does have a quality amount of hand disruption, which is going to be very good against all of these rare candy decks. We even have free retreat with Leaf. We've got some damage modifiers with red and Guzma, which acts as a damage modifier in most case scenarios. We've got a couple of Gust cards and Sabrina and Cyrus, a couple of healing cards in PCL and Potion, of course, and then some draw, right, with Professor's Research and 2 Pokeball. It's Giratina Darkrai, guys. Come on, I mean, there's nothing really else to say other than the fact that, like I said, the Poison variant, which is really just a less consistent version of Giratina Darkrai, stopped seeing play, and that's predominantly because it didn't have to see play. It wasn't actually providing any value when you took a look at what the, what kind of lists or what were in the decks of the Oricorio decks that people were playing most commonly, which, is quite interesting. I'm going to be honest with you. So anyway, that is the #1 deck, or I guess the deck that got first place in this tournament, 12-1. But another player had the same record, right? And we kind of talk about this all of the time. I think people put a little bit too much stock, a little bit too much value in the standings, right? They see a deck get first place in the tournament, and they automatically might assume that that is the #1 deck to be playing right now. But that's really not how the data works, and that's not how tournament results work, because there's a lot of variance in day 2. And at the end of the video, we'll take a look at the real data, which will showcase like the real winners of the tournament in terms of which archetypes were the winners. The standings really just showcase which players won the tournament, and of course what decks they're playing. Giratina Darkrai, it won this week, and that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody because it is one of the best decks in the game, one of the best decks of all time. Now, what's really interesting here at second place, again, this player with the same record, 12-1-1, did lose in the finals to Giratina Darkrai, but made it all the way to the finals, and that is going to be this player playing Sylveon and Solgaleo. And this is a really interesting deck because Solgaleo has really dipped in play. It hasn't been the most popular deck for quite some time now. A lot of Charizard in the format, a lot of Oricorio in the format. Traditionally, these are matchups that Solgaleo struggles with, right? Which you might think, well, if that's the case, then why would anybody play Solgaleo in the format right now? This new version of Solgaleo really does stand up to a lot of the previously bad matchups, and this is going to be almost a direct copy and paste version of Solgaleo, kind of copying Charizard's homework. This is quite honestly basically the exact same deck list as Charizard, just played slightly differently with like different cards, but the strategy is basically the exact same. This popped up earlier last week, and it's actually been one of the stronger decks since then, and this is going to be the new and improved version of Solgaleo, playing Sylveon EX just like Charizard does, right? So 2 stage 1s here, or sorry, 2 of the basics with Cosmog, and then 2 of the stage 2 with Solgaleo, just like Charmander and Charizard does. 2 EV, 2 Sylveon, just like Charizard does, and then 1 additional non-EX attacking Pokemon to get around Oricorio. In this case, it's Magearna, and Charizard, they play Flareon. So very, very similar Pokemon compositions, basically identical. 2 Research, 2 Sabrina in this list, which is very, very interesting. I actually do believe that double Sabrina is phenomenal in Solgaleo. I think it's one of the bigger reasons why this deck list has been so successful. 1 Lily, 1 Guzma, another another really, really important card in the deck. And then 2 Pokeballs, 2 rare candies, and then 1 leftovers. Leftovers typically considered to be a better option for Solgaleo than Giant Cape. Basically, a lot of decks are playing Guzma to discard Giant Cape, so Leftovers at least lets you heal for 10 HP before they discard it, right? One thing to note, Leftovers only procs at the end of your turn. Solgaleo takes 10 damage after it attacks, right, and it ends your turn. So it basically negates that damage that Solgaleo does whenever it uses the Soul Breaker attack. It's just better than Giant Cape, trust me on that. So anyway, let's talk about the stuff that's interesting with this deck list. One being, of course, Magearna. So again, this Magearna and the 2 Sabrina are here predominantly to get around Oricorio, right? Theoretically speaking, Magearna can take one KO at least on an Oricorio, right? And as long as we're able to KO one Oricorio, the 2 Sabrina should allow us to basically win the game right there, right? Not only that, but Sabrina's really strong against a variety of different Pokemon and matchups in the metagame right now. A couple examples of that would be against Sylvally, right? So Sylvally's extremely strong, especially when it goes second. We all know that, but one of the main counterplays to Sylvally is knocking it off of its energy curve by forcing it out of the active spot with Sabrina, forcing it to go into whether it's the fossil or just another type null or whatever it is, and then forcing them to have to attach an energy to that Pokemon to either retreat out or just spend an extra turn not attacking, right? So an early Sabrina is going to turn or going to set back Sylvally a turn behind, which is very, very important in that matchup, especially when Sylvally goes second. Again, most prominently, it's there for the Oricorios to just sort of move them out of the way, and then, of course, we just win the game that way, especially with Magearna, so keep that in mind. But the other scenario where Sabrina's really good is going to be against Charizard. And there might be other scenarios, but off the top of my head, Charizard is another big one. Charizard is another Pokemon which oftentimes isn't always in the active spot, right? So you got to imagine a lot of times Charizard maybe has an EV in the active spot. They attach an energy, maybe they evolve or maybe they collect or whatever, and then on turn 2, they manually retreat into their Charizard, then they attach, and then they stoke, right? But that leaves 0 energies on all of its bench Pokemon and 4 energies onto Charizard, right? So if you Sabrina them, then that's another turn where Charizard can't attack because they're not playing any free retreat cards. So these Sabrinas are not only there to get around Oricorio, but they're there to basically stall for a turn early in the game for your opponents who maybe have gotten off to a really hot start. So 2 Sabrina is absolutely phenomenal in this deck list. And I think that this Solgaleo deck is extremely well built, and I find this to be very interesting, probably and mostly because Solgaleo is a Pokemon that is always exceedingly popular, and it's seen played a lot of different ways. You got to keep in mind when Solgaleo first released, 3 seasons ago, it was played with Skarmory, and it was very popular, but it was actually massively underwhelming, and it didn't perform very well. Last format, people played Solgaleo with Shiinotic, which actually was a fairly well-positioned deck in the metagame, at least at some point. I had it in the S tier, and then this format, it's kind of reached its full potential here as like a Charizard clone, right, with Sylveon and Magearna. It's still probably going to struggle against Charizard in the head-to-head matchup, but because we're playing 2 Sabrina and we have the Sylveon package to fly through our deck list, we always have the potential to take that KO. The upside to Solgaleo is that it doesn't actually matter if Sylveon's in the active spot. We never actually have to attach to that active EEVEE or Sylveon or Magearna to retreat. And that's an upside. Charizard can't do that, right? Because of Rising Road, we can always commit those energies to our Cosmog and attack on turn 2 going second. That's not something that Charizard can do, which is very, very, very important. So I think the Solgaleo deck is phenomenal. In fact, I actually think it's one of the better decks of the format. We'll have to see tomorrow where I put it on the tier list, but I think that this new and improved version of Solgaleo is certainly one of the better decks in the entire game right now, and I think it's built extremely well for the current metagame. Okay, we've talked a lot already just about 2 deck lists, so we got to move a little bit quicker. Here at 3rd place, this is the highest placing Sylveon and Greninja deck list. I honestly thought that we would see a three-peat in this format of Greninja, Giratina, and Sylveon. It won the first 2 Ursa Days tournaments, and I was half expecting it to win again this week. And the reason why I believe it's been so successful is because not only is it seeing a ton of play, it's over 20% of the meta share over the last few weeks, but it's just a deck list that is consistent and also like a high roll deck, right? It's one of these sort of board states where if it does get set up early enough, there's really not much you can do, right? Like if they go turn 2 rare candy into Greninja, if they're drawing through their deck with Sylveon, they get that Giratina out on turn 1 and they get some psychic energies in their zone, and then they're, boosting up this Giratina super early. Like it's really difficult to deal with, right? Because there's so much damage, there's so much flexibility in terms of its win conditions here with the double Cyrus with Greninja, with the damage from Giratina, the hand disruption thrown in, the giant capes as well to extend our HP. This deck list potentially is unbeatable, right? In the perfect board state and in the perfect scenario. And then enough people are playing this deck list that it's just going to end up happening more and more often, right? And that's why I believe that we saw a couple of the players in the previous weeks playing Sylveon and Giratina just inevitably winning the tournament, is because, someone's going to get lucky, right? They're going to draw their cards and they're going to play properly and they're going to be very difficult to beat. I think this is a great deck. it does actually have a bit of a losing matchup against Solgaleo, against Giratina Darkrai, against Charizard, and against, I believe, another deck list, which is off the top of my head, I can't remember. But what's interesting about this deck is it seemingly has, technically a negative win rate against the other most popular decks of the format. But the main reason why its overall win rate continues to be so high is because it does very well against a lot of the non-meta decks, or like the fringe decks or the meme decks. It's kind of a gatekeeper in that sense, where it oftentimes just beats the decks that really aren't considered top decks. And for that reason, it always has a very, very high win rate. We'll take a look at the metadata at the end of the tournament. I think we all understand this deck list and what it's all about. Tremendously high upside and honestly a pretty low downside is really what makes this deck list so strong. And there's not really any direct counter to it, which is the other big portion of this deck and the big reason why I think it's so good. I know I just mentioned that it technically has a losing win rate against a lot of the other top decks of the format, but those aren't terrible win rates, right? There's nothing that can go up against, this deck list, this archetype, and have like a 70+% win rate. It just doesn't exist, right? Most of the other decks in the format do have a specific hard counter that they lose almost all of the time to. This deck list doesn't have that. Every single one of its matchups is pretty close to 50%, which is, I think, a big reason why this deck list always ends up doing well in tournaments and why it deserves to see as much play as it has seen. Let's take a look at the 4th place list really quickly and see if there's any differences here. There is, in fact, one difference, which is going to be cutting one Cyrus for one Irida. This is quite interesting. This is probably going to help us maybe a little bit more in the Oricorio matchup and some other niche scenarios. Irida, as a healing card, was seeing more play in this archetype earlier on in the format. Of course, this deck is playing water and psychic energies. If we go back, Solgaleo's playing metal, Charizard plays fire, Giratina Darkrai plays dark energies. This deck list plays dual energies, which you would also think is an inherent downside to the deck. But it really doesn't matter if we're playing dual energies or not, because Giratina Darkrai is generating is generating its own psychic energies, so it kind of bypasses that whole dual energy thing. One of the few examples where a dual energy deck ends up being a top tier deck, which is interesting, but it's the power of Giratina EX, truthfully. But yeah, one Irida is interesting. It was seeing a little bit more play earlier on in the format. I don't think it's necessarily as valuable as just having a second Cyrus. You might be thinking to yourself, well, really, I only need one Cyrus to win the game, and I'm moving through my deck quite quickly with Sylveon. But the idea here is that you want to have that Cyrus at the right time, and playing 2 copies of it really just allows you basically to almost always have it when you need it to. It's more of a consistency thing instead of like a requirement to be able to use Cyrus twice to win the game. We really only need it once, but that's typically why we're playing 2 of it, because it's so important. But anyway, I think Irida is a good card. It's just situational. We heal 40 damage from any of our Pokemon with water energies attached. Again, that can be good against some scenarios where we're living maybe 2 hits. I don't know necessarily what those scenarios would be, but theoretically speaking, that is something that matters, right? So anyway, 1 Irida instead of 2 Cyrus, I think that's interesting. I don't know if it's better in my mind, but it is, I guess, a thing that people are doing. And let's take a look at the 5th place Giratina and Darkrai deck, honestly, really quick to see if there's any differences here. There has to be, I think. Is there something different here? There are 2 potions, okay? So there's 2 potions in here, and then he's cut the Guzma, I guess, is off the top of my head if I remember. So no Guzma in the list. He's still playing red. Guzma and red are a little bit redundant, I'll be fair, but there are some scenarios where red is technically better than Guzma, right? But there's a lot of scenarios where Guzma is better than red. So I guess removing that bit of redundancy, playing both 1 red and 1 Guzma, now we're playing just 2 potions with 1 Pokemon Center Lady. So for some additional healing, probably going to help us in that Oricorio matchup again. So yeah, I don't know if it changes the deck that much. That 1 extra potion might be relevant. I'm not exactly sure, but 99% of the deck is going to function the same regardless of that 1 card change. So there you go. Here at 7th place is the highest placed Charizard deck list. Now, I love Charizard. I love it and I hate it. I think this is the silliest deck in the entire game. It's no surprise to me that Solgaleo has popped onto the scene playing, again, basically an identical deck list, because I think that this particular strategy here is probably something we're going to see a lot of moving forward for Stage 2 Pokemon that are applicable to this particular strategy. And by that, I mean, Stage 2 Pokemon that, can attack for a low energy cost or set themselves up easily, like Charizard, like Solgaleo, like Garchomp even. That's probably where we're going to see this sort of Sylveon combination here, right? Because the synergy between Charizard and Sylveon, of course, is being that Sylveon moves through our deck really quickly and we can more consistently get that rare candy Charizard combo off. But the idea here is that Charizard can stoke for 1 energy, which means that we can actually afford to attach to the active EEVEE/Sylveon and then just retreat out, attach to Charizard and then stoke. And then either way, we're attacking on turn 3. So Charizard actually has pretty good synergy with Sylveon in that sense, and we don't really need any like X speed or a leaf card to retreat. The only scenario where that doesn't become the case is whether we're going, I think if we're going first and we're leading EEVEE, then we can't stoke ever until turn 3, which feels quite bad, honestly. Solgaleo doesn't have that problem. That might be one of the upsides to Solgaleo as opposed to Charizard, but Charizard does actually win the head-to-head matchup just because we're hitting for weakness on Solgaleo. But Charizard is incredible. Now, one thing that we're going to see here, and for whatever the reason, and I've talked about this every single time that we brought up Charizard and that we've seen it see play in tournaments, is the 2 cards right here, because everything else about the deck is the same. The 2 Lily, the 2 Research, 2 Pokeball, 2 Rare Candy, the Giant Cape, and then the Pokemon. This is all standard stuff, but the only thing that, for whatever the reason, people always do with this deck is play 1 copy of Mars and 1 copy of Sabrina. Now, I think the 1 copy of Sabrina is needed along with Flareon to beat the Oricorio matchups, just like Solgaleo is playing Sabrina and, of course, is also playing Magearna, right? So it's the same idea, but the Mars here is what really gets me. For whatever the reason, people are playing Mars in this deck list, most commonly. And listen, I think Mars is a really great card. I really do. I think that Mars is very, very useful in almost every deck list, but there's so many scenarios when I'm playing Charizard where I need to do a 1-hit KO, where I need to KO out my opponent's Pokemon in 1 attack. Solgaleo is playing, they're playing leftovers, right? So they heal and then we can't KO Solgaleo. Like that's an issue, right? Not getting the 1-hit KO on Solgaleo is a massive issue. Giratina Darkrai is playing Rocky Helmet and they're playing Giant Cape. Those are 2 cards that can lose you the matchup when you're playing Charizard, that chip damage as well as, bringing their HP above 150, right? What is it? Sylveon and Greninja plays Giant Cape to give Giratina and Leafeon more than 150 HP. Go down the line. Every deck list is playing a Giant Cape that will move their Pokemon from being below 150 HP to above 150. That's very, very important. Charizard is all about taking big 1-hit KOs, right? That's the sort of the whole thing with the deck list. So the only way to counter that is to play Guzma. I've said this time and time again. The number 1 ranked player in Pokemon Pocket right now in ranked mode. I might pull this up on the screen. I might not, but just take my word for it. I think it's Sigun or S1GUN, whatever his tag is. He's been playing Charizard Sylveon, but guess what? Instead of Mars, he plays Guzma. You have to play Guzma and Charizard. That's my opinion. I really feel strongly about that. I think that swapping Mars for Guzma makes the deck so much better, like a lot better. It's like the number 1 win condition card when I'm playing Charizard is getting the Guzma to discard the tool cards from our opponent's Pokemon. So I'm just going to leave that tangent there. Charizard's very good, but for whatever the reason, nobody's playing Guzma. Swap Mars for Guzma. I think you'll have a much better time. That's my own personal opinion. Anyway, okay, so at 8th place, we've also got Sylvally Oricorio. Sylvally Oricorio, and this is what I mean, and what I've really said for the last few days is that the format's coming around full circle. So on Friday's video about the best decks for ranked mode, I talked about Sylvally Oricorio, I talked about Tapu Koko Arceus and Oricorio, and I said that these decks are really controlling the metagame right now. Those were sort of the counter meta decks. Oricorio rose as kind of the top option last week for sure, and the reason for that mainly was because it was like the number 1 counter meta deck, right? When you took a look at the old Solgaleo list, when you took a look at Charizard and all of these decks, Giratina Darkrai, they like kind of struggled against Oricorio. Could they beat Oricorio? For sure. But their average win rates were negative against Oricorio deck lists. So this was, of course, the most common way to play Oricorio, but Tapu Koko and Arceus was very relevant. The counter meta had definitely emerged in that second week, and it was Oricorio. But what we're seeing this week is a counter to the counter meta, right? All of the other decks in the format are adjusting to the uptick in Oricorio seeing play, and therefore balancing out the counter meta with the counter meta. We're confusing things a bunch, but basically everything comes around full circle, and this is what happens, right? When we go into like the 3rd or 4th week of a format, things come around full circle and then they balance out, right? Everything kind of becomes a lot more spread out and well balanced, and then we have really what I call kind of the true reflection of the format. Every kind of season and every metagame and every format comes in like phases, and these phases kind of all like happen per week, you know? So the first week is always like a bunch of new decks that see play, and what happens is either one deck really kind of emerges as just the one deck that's much better than all of the other new decks, and it sees a bunch of play, but what oftentimes happens is that older deck lists that people aren't really accounting for end up being, of course, even better than they were in previous formats, because people just sort of forget about them, or they don't really account for them or counterplay them. And then they end up being extremely dominant. And then Oricorio comes in to just sort of counter all of those deck lists. And then all of the other deck lists in the third week end up kind of counterplaying Oricorio, and then everything balances out. So we're now going into this third week. I'm going on a massive tangent, is what I call kind of the true reflection of the metagame right now, which is where we have about 4 or 5 decks really at the top of the metagame that are all pretty balanced in terms of their positioning. And that's what we're seeing right now. So Sylvally Oricorio, still one of the top decks of the format, but is being definitely accounted for much more than it was when it kind of popped up last week. So yeah, I think that Sylvally Oricorio is really strong, one of the better decks of the format. This deck is playing 1 Zeraora and 2 Oricorio. Sometimes they play 2 Zeraora and 2 Oricorio. Either way, I think the deck functions very similarly. Sylvally rather, and Zeraora, two of the best sort of aggressive cards in the game. They fit very well with Oricorio, which is the main control card in the game. And now we have a very aggressive archetype that can also kind of play a control style and win games that way. So still one of the better decks of the format, but definitely something that people are counterplaying, or I guess accounting for pretty heavily. And then, yeah, that's basically kind of it as far as like all of the decks go. At 16th place here at 8-3, we do have one Flareon and Leafeon, which is another interesting point to, I guess, discuss in this video. So this deck list is actually playing the Genetic Apex Flareon instead of the Leafeon, which hits for 90 damage, which is interesting. I've actually mentioned this. I feel like this Flareon, even though it attacks for 3 energies and not 2 energies, is still really strong. The thing about the Leafeon is that it has to get powered up by Leafeon EX because we're only playing fire energies in this deck. We're not playing any grass energies in the deck list, which is why, of course, Leafeon is very important in this particular strategy because it can generate grass energies to itself, right? Which, you know, allows it to be really consistent. Not only is it an extra energy, but it allows you to play it with all of these fire decks or fire Pokemon that are in the deck like Flareon and whatnot. The thing with this deck list is that going into the second week, it was very popular. It was kind of the flavor of the week type deal, but it was a very fun deck, a very consistent deck, and honestly, one of the better decks in the game. I think it just sort of flowed together really well. And when it popped onto the scene, it did well. It never really won, I don't think, any large tournaments, maybe some of the other less large tournaments, but maybe it won a couple. I don't really remember. But never like super kind of popped off at the Ursa Days tournaments. Like, I don't know how to explain it. It's seen a decent amount of play, but at this point, again, I think it's kind of settling into a spot where it's a consistent deck list, it's a quality deck list, but it's just not going to see nearly as much play as Sylveon and Greninja and Giratina, which I think is the other kind of top like tempo-based deck in the game. And it also struggles against Charizard and traditionally also kind of struggles against Oricorio. So I think those are kind of a little bit downsides to this deck list. We are still playing the one Flareon and one Sabrina. So theoretically speaking, you know, we can get around Oricorio, but that will still be a tough matchup. Charizard one-kills all of our Pokemon, which is, again, a bit of a downside when we're playing against Charizard for sure. So, you know, I like this deck list a lot. I just think that it's really kind of dipped down a little bit. I think it's probably still a very solid A-tier deck list. I just don't really think that it's like at the top of the meta in my mind. I could be surprised. Maybe this deck pops off and wins next weekend, but to be honest, the way I look at this deck is that it's very good. It's a very decent quality deck, but it's just not like contending for that like top spot like some of the other decks have been on this format. Getting 16th place here today is pretty good, honestly, and there was another down here at 22nd place. But anyway, Flareon, Leafeon, a very, very fun deck, a very cool deck list, but not something that I would really consider to be like extremely popular right now or like extremely good. But, you know, as far as decks go, there's not many decks that are better than it, honestly. If we go down here, there is one Buzzwole at 25th place, and this is going to be Buzzwole and Pheromosa. I think Buzzwole's really good. I've talked about it, I think, over the last few weeks. You know, Buzzwole was by far the #1 deck of the previous format, and for that reason, it had to be, you know, somewhat relevant in the format after this, right? I mean, nothing's really changed about Buzzwole. Nothing's really necessarily hard countered it. I think the only downside to Buzzwole really in this format is that fire decks became just a bit more common, and Solgaleo, which are two things that Buzzwole has always struggled against. Charizard wasn't like super popular last format, and Solgaleo was popular. It was like the #1 counter to Buzzwole. Giratina and Darkrai kind of, you know, is a good matchup for Buzzwole EX. Oricorio, it's not something it's really struggled against. Sylvally Rampardos, it's always done well against. So Buzzwole was really dominant last format, but this format has had to deal with a little bit more uptick of Charizard and Solgaleo, which I think is a bit of a struggle. And then the Greninja deck should theoretically be a good matchup as well, right? We have a lot of healing. We have Leaf Cape. We can also do bench damage. We're also playing 2 Cyrus. So it's very similar to the Sylveon Giratina deck list. It's a little bit, I don't know how to explain it. It's like a little bit less hard hitting and a little bit more like consistent kind of tempo based with like more HP modifiers, which is interesting, but it's very actually similar to Sylveon, Greninja, and Giratina in how it plays and what its win conditions are. I think Buzzwole's still a really quality deck list, but again, Charizard really kind of bursted onto the scene and has been probably the #2 or #3 deck of the format so far. And I think that's a big struggle for Buzzwole because Solgaleo is right there behind it, right? So Buzzwole does well in certain matchups, but struggles against other matchups. It's also not like super popular, so, you know, I don't think it's going to really take over anytime soon. What do we got? Next up, we have Skubert at 28th place from Norway, and this was Magnezone. I think that Magnezone is, kind of due to pop off. This is actually an interesting deck list here with 2 Tapu Lele and a ton of Pokemon, right? We're playing 12 Pokemon in the deck list, 2 EEVEE, 2 Tapu Lele, 2 Magnemite, so a ton of like leadoff options. This deck list is playing probably Psychic and Electric energies. If not, it's playing only Lightning energies, which is interesting because only Psychic energies, which is interesting because Tapu Lele takes 1 Psychic energy to attack, right? So if we're playing dual energies, we're not always able to get this attack off with Tapu Lele. Tapu Lele was something that was actually really relevant at one point in the meta, but was kind of forced out by Sylvally because Sylvally just kind of overcame it a little bit too aggressively. But I think it actually fits quite well with Magnezone. The Sylveon Magnezone deck has been around for a couple of weeks now, and it's been consistently one of the better decks in the metagame. I just don't think it's necessarily, again, catching on like some of the other decks are. What's cool about this Magnezone deck, though, is that it's not playing Oricorio. So when it's one of like the few electric decks in the game that doesn't play Oricorio, and it really does kind of focus around hoping that your opponent can't one-hit KO Magnezone. But again, 110 damage is kind of a direct counter to Sylvally. Like, that's where Magnezone has really found its place in the metagame. But unfortunately, it's just not something that I think is as well positioned against a lot of the other things in the game. So, Magnezone is cool. I really do think so. If Sylvally ever is like by far the most dominant deck of the format, Magnezone also countered Meowscarada back in the day. So Magnezone always finds its way as like the counter to like the non-EX attacking Pokemon, if that makes sense, right? So things like Meowscarada, things like Sylvally, like Magnezone counters them. And I think that's kind of Magnezone's position in the metagame. It just has a lot of HP. It really does. And Magneton is pretty cool. The inherent downside to this deck, unfortunately, is that we rely on that middle evolution. There's no real way around that. Because Magnezone is 3 energies to attack. So we are very reliant on kind of getting the 1, 2, 3, in 3 turns in a row, whereas like the other rare candy decks don't have to do that. They just have to get the basic out, and then they can kind of pop off and immediately go into the stage 2 Pokemon. Things like Solgaleo, like Charizard, like Garchomp, like Rampardos, they can all do that, where Magnezone just can't, which is a bit of a downside to it for sure. But anyway, there it is. We've already talked about it for sure, but that Tapu Lele is quite interesting. One Garchomp right here at 30th place. Garchomp is one where I actually thought it was a really strong choice in ranked battles this week, but again, I just feel like it's kind of declined a little bit in tournament play going into this 3rd week, and I think a big reason for that is probably, like I said, a lot of decks are counterplaying Oricorio. Even though Oricorio is common right now in the format, I just think that Garchomp's probably going to struggle when you compare it to like a lot of the other really strong decks of the format, like Charizard, like Solgaleo, like Giratina Darkrai. It's just inherently like not as consistent of a deck list as a lot of the other top decks are. But because it's fighting, it is a very strong deck against the Electric type decks. So that's really the niche that Garchomp kind of fits into. And yeah, I don't really have much else to say about it other than that. I like Garchomp, I really do. Inherently, it's just weaker than, Charizard and Solgaleo. It is cool to be able to hit 50 damage to the bench, and Rampardos is absolutely broken for sure. But there's just a lot going on with this deck, right? There's just a little bit too much going on, tons of Pokemon. It's kind of a pile is what I call this. It's just a bunch of cards, and you hope that you draw all the right ones. Sometimes you do, but, more often than not, you're probably not, and that's a bit of a downside for sure. And then lastly, let's take a look here at 39th place. The highest placing Arceus and Tapu Koko deck, which again, something that I thought last week was phenomenal. I thought it was literally one of the best choices, if not like the best choice to be playing. I think I literally said that this deck list has the highest win rate. It's got the best sort of matchup spreads if you're playing in ranked mode. And this is 1 Tapu Koko, 1 Arceus, 2 Electrical Cord, 1 Dawn, 1 Giovanni, 1 Cyrus, 1 Sabrina, 1 Mars, 1 Giant Cape, 1 PCL. I mean, it's just got a little of everything, honestly. I really like this deck list. I think it's still probably one of the better decks in the entire game. One thing I will say though which is why like the results probably don't show this deck list always doing extremely well, is because it just doesn't see that much play. Even though I have promoted it on the channel a little bit recently, most people are just going to elect to play Sylvally with Zeraora and Oricorio and not this package. Even though I think this deck list actually has a little bit more merit in the format right now than Sylvally does. In general, I think that this deck deserves to see more play, but very few people probably played it this weekend. And for that, it's, no surprise that we didn't see it like super high up on the standings. But anyway, there you go. Yeah, that's kind of it. There was Sylvally Rampardos here at 47th place, but we all know what that deck list is, so I'm not going to kind of look at it. So that's really it. That's kind of all of the decks that are in the metagame right now, or at least at the top of the metagame. The next thing that we're going to do is take a look at the metagame tab, and then we're going to review all of the data, the win rates, the matchups, the day 2 conversion rates. We're going to go into the actual data, which is where we provide all of the actual context for everything that we just took a look at with the standings, right? I know a lot of people are just interested in the deck lists, and that's why we showcase them first off. in the video. But if you really want to understand the metagame and what's going on right now, this is the part of the video that's, I think, going to help you guys the most. So anyway, let's dive right into it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, guys. And yeah, so here we go. So this is the combined sort of statistics for the entire tournament. As we see, Sylveon and Greninja, 22.73% of the meta share, which is pretty massive. This is amongst the highest that we've ever seen in Pokemon Pocket since I've been reviewing the data. The only other decks like in the history of Pokemon Pocket that have had this level of a meta share is like a Giratina Darkrai back in its heyday, like Mewtwo and Mew back in like the original format. So I mean, this is amongst the highest in terms of meta share that we've really ever seen in a format. Or I guess, what's the other one? Arceus and Dialga, right? In Triumphant Light metagame, that was like pushing 30% some weeks. But anyway, 413 to 359, which is a 52.61% win rate. And that's quite impressive. I mean, it really is. For a deck list to see this high meta share and to have this high win rate is actually pretty impressive because, again, I always say it that the more a deck sees play, the more matchups it is against itself, right? That's just the reality. Like we see the most common matchup was against itself, and that's going to skew its win rate, right? Closer to 50%. So very impressive for it to have such a high win rate with such a high meta share. Definitely, in my mind, just the top deck of the meta right now. The second most played deck was Charizard this week. Again, most people, and again, we'll take a look at this right now. 75 people played it. That's 13% of the meta share, and it had a 47.25% win rate, 206 to 221. So actually a little bit negative win rate for Charizard and Sylveon. No surprise because of how much Oricorio was seeing play and whatnot. But anyway, Charizard, Sylveon, one of the best decks in the game, probably the most powerful deck in Pokemon Pocket right now, but definitely has its struggles and its inconsistency problems. But anyway, one thing that we're going to do here, which is why I believe Charizard has a little bit of a lower win rate, and I'll just explain this right now, is if we go into here and then we take a look at the cards, we can actually see the average amount of cards that people are playing in the deck list. And here's the thing. 81% of decks are playing one copy of Mars. So that's literally 81% of all of these Charizard players were playing Mars in their deck list, and only 17% here were playing Guzma. I clicked on the thing on accident. Only 17% are playing Guzma. That to me is a big red flag because, again, like I said, I do believe Charizard is much better when we're playing Guzma, and only 80% were playing Giant Cape as well, which I think is important. So anyway, I think that's a big reason why Charizard probably struggled a little bit more. Also, like the data from one tournament isn't like the end of the world. Like if we take a look at all of these players here, all of these players probably never even showed up to the tournament, which probably skews the win rates for sure. But a lot of the players ended up making day two, right? I mean, all of these players were day two participants, which is pretty impressive for Charizard. But anyway, yeah, Charizard, the second most played deck, 47.25% win rate. Next up is Sylvally Oricorio. Almost 9% of the meta share, 124 to 151. That's a 45% win rate. Definitely a bit lower than it was in previous weeks, and I think that is actually quite interesting considering what I was saying before about the meta really coming around full circle. So a lot of decks like that Solgaleo deck, like we talked about, just a ton of things that are really counterplaying Oricorio. The metagame has shifted away from it or to counter it, and that's why the win rate is so low, really amongst the lowest win rates out of any of the most played decks of the format, which is quite interesting. Giratina and Darkrai, the deck list that won this tournament, 6% of the meta share went 101 to 102 in 4 ties. So I'm going to call this effectively a 50% win rate. So nothing super substantial, right? When you take a look at this data, Sylveon and Greninja definitely performed much better than Giratina Darkrai, but Giratina Darkrai did end up getting first place in this tournament. So that's where the data really kind of shows the full story there. Anyway, quite interesting to see how well it did in this tournament, which is about 50%, which is really where I put Giratina and Darkrai right now, kind of right in the middle, right? It's a really strong deck, and I think that it's always a decent choice, right? And again, it ended up winning the tournament, but overall had about a 50% win rate. Leafeon and Flareon, 90 to 107. That's 6% almost of the meta share, and that's also a 45% win rate. Also a deck list, I believe, that struggled mainly because Charizard and Sylvally Oricorio saw so much play. Those are two decks that this deck doesn't really love to go up against, so yeah, interesting. Buzzwole Pheromosa, very poor win rate as we see actually here, 42.97%, 55 and 71. These sample sizes are getting a bit smaller here, just under 4% meta share, but also kind of struggled, right? So again, a lot of the decks in the format right now probably aren't, great matchups for Buzzwole. Tapu Koko and Arceus, this is another interesting point here. Only 18 people played it, went 38 and 66, which is horrible. But if we go down here to Arceus and Tapu Koko, they went 31 and 24, and that's a 55% win rate. The difference here is if you're playing 2 copies of Tapu Koko or not. For whatever the reason, the decks that were playing 1 copy of Tapu Koko did a lot better, for sure. But just like Sylvally or Oricorio, I just think that the metagame really shifted away from these decks and ended up being more balanced towards the counter meta, which again, we talked a lot about Friday, but a big reason why these deck lists probably went a bit lower in win rate for sure. Guzzlord here, 35% win rate, terrible. 3% of the meta share, 29 and 51. Very bad outing for Guzzlord. Garchomp, 47 and 44, actually a winning matchup this weekend, which is quite interesting. But again, counter to the counter meta, strong against the Oricorio decks, which saw a ton of play. Charizard doing quite well for that reason, in my mind. And now here is some of the more interesting data that we'll take a look at, because Solgaleo and Sylveon did get second place in the tournament, but there's two different ways still that people are playing Solgaleo, as we see the old version Solgaleo and Shiinotic, 15 and 32, very, very bad record this weekend. However, Sylveon and Solgaleo, that list that we saw got second place, went 23 and 19, so that's a 53.5% win rate, much better to be fair. And then, of course, Sylvally, Zeraora went 50-50. Greninja and Oricorio struggled 16 and 26. And then Magnezone actually did a little bit good here, 27 and 24. So, yeah, I think that kind of gives the full perspective, right? I know that the standings are what people look at, but if you really want to know, like, in terms of the archetypes, like which deck lists, like which archetypes did the best in the tournament, like this is where the data showcases that. This week was really, really strong for decks that were good against Oricorio, as we see here. Sylveon and Greninja did well. And if we go down, of course, Garchomp did well. Sylvally Rampardos did fairly well. The new Solgaleo deck did well. Tapu, Koko, and Arceus did well. And there you go, right? Everything else kind of struggled, honestly, which, you know, is really what the data kind of showcases, if we're being honest with you. That's kind of what we've been talking about here. Let's take a look here at the day 2 conversion rates and stuff, and then we'll wrap up the video. So let's click right here, playing to win. And we'll see that Sylveon Greninja went from, 23% of the meta share up to 36 of the day 2 meta share. 23 of the 64 people in this tournament played Sylveon and Greninja, right? They literally was more than 1/3 of day 2 was Sylveon and Greninja, which is a very impressive day 2 conversion rate. Did very well in the Swiss rounds of day 1 of the tournament. Charizard also increased here to 19% of the meta share, so 12 people playing Charizard made it. Both of these decks actually went completely 50-50 though in day 2, which again is pretty typical, right? I mean, it's a single elimination bracket, so these decks went 50-50. Sylvally Oricorio went, let me check here. So this was originally 8% or almost 9% of the meta share, and then in day 2 was jumped up a little bit, but not nothing really too significant. 6 people playing it also went 6 and 6. Flareon and Leafeon, 4 people made it into day 2. They went 3 and 4. The big surprise here, the massive surprise, and again, this is a very small sample size, is Giratina and Darkrai, right? Only 4 people in day 2 were playing Giratina and Darkrai, but they collectively went 10 and 3, which is very, very impressive, honestly. So again, that's a small sample size. What does that tell us? Really, it just tells us that a couple of Giratina Darkrai players kind of got, I don't want to say lucky, but they kind of did, you know, a little, they probably had good matchups against Sylveon and Greninja, if we're being honest with you, right? So for that reason, they probably just kind of farmed them in day 2 and ended up going 10 and 3, which is kind of much more impressive than anything else, other than the one Sylveon Solgaleo player, which went 5 and 1 in this tournament, which is pretty cool. There was a Snorlax Delcatty deck in here, which we'll save for a later video, which is pretty funny, that made day 2. But yeah, that's the day 2 results, right? So honestly, like Sylveon Greninja went 50-50, Charizard went 50-50, Sylvally Oricorio went 50-50, and then Giratina Darkrai really kind of popped up, and at least a couple of players really farmed day 2 quite significantly. One, of course, being the player that won, and then I think the other player that got 4th place really kind of carried the record in day 2 for Giratina and Darkrai. So, you know, this is just one sample size. It's just one example. People like to argue the data a lot, especially in our Discord server. There's been a lot of arguments around certain stuff. The reality is that, one tournament is just a snapshot in time, right? And as quickly as these tournament results kind of get displayed and showcased, the metagame changes almost immediately, right? And I think what we're going to end up going into for this last week or last couple of weeks of this format is a very balanced metagame approach, and most of these decks will probably end up being fairly decent. And of course, Giratina Darkrai is going to be one of those decks. This week, it ended up just kind of getting pretty fortunate, right? And a couple of players ended up popping off. And again, I think that Giratina Darkrai is going to emerge as one of the more consistently good matchups against Sylveon and Greninja, which means that Giratina Darkrai really has found its place until, of course, Oricorio ends up changing their deck list to more heavily counter Giratina and Darkrai, which I suspect probably will happen as the weeks go on. But anyway, guys, there's the video. There is Meta Monday, week 3 of the EEVEE Grow format. We go over a ton of data in these videos, and we talk about things very, very in depth. So I know it's a little bit difficult to I guess, consume sometimes, right? But, you know, that's why we put the timestamps in here. Not everybody is, you know, interested in all of the data and all of the metrics and the statistics, whether you're just here for the deck lists or you're curious who won the tournament or you really are interested in the metadata. That's all stuff that we showcase here in this video. So hopefully it was useful to you guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The tier list, the updated, I guess, probably final tier list of this format we'll probably do tomorrow. And that'll be kind of my final, you know, power rankings, my final standings for this EEVEE Grow format. And then we'll kind of wrap this up. And then sometime early next week is when the Pokemon Presents comes. And then we'll probably get an announcement for what the A4 set will be coming up, which is set to release here in just 2 weeks almost, which is very interesting, very, very fun. So yeah, I got nothing else to say, honestly. Let's wrap up the video here, guys. Peace out. Have a good one. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you guys later. And yeah, bye.